Hey everyone, this is Dan Cohen with Behind the Headlines. Today we're going to be talking about the new Cold War. U.S. relations with both China and Russia have deteriorated even further over the last week in what I think is a defining early moment of the Biden administration. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met with Chinese Director of Foreign Affairs Yen Jiechi and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Alaska in what turned into a verbal confrontation. So today I'm going to be talking with Carl Zha, one of the top U.S. watchers in the world, who inhabits the nightmares of pretty much every pseudo-China expert here in Washington. He's the host of the Silk and Steel podcast. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you for that intro as a America watcher. That's a good flip on the China watcher moniker. I'm so always glad to talk to you, and I think we're going to have fun on this one because I saw the clip of the Reuters highlights of the dialogue in Anchorage. I share on Twitter. It has like 3,000 likes right now.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a huge moment. So first, let's listen to these sound bites, and then we'll kind of react to them.
We'll have an opportunity to discuss key priorities, both domestic and global. We'll also discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States.
On cyber attacks, let me say that whether it's the ability to launch cyber attacks or the technologies that could be deployed, the United States is the champion in this regard.
Secretary Blinken laid out many of the areas of concern, from economic and military coercion to assaults on basic values. These are the concerns that are on the minds of the American people. But it goes beyond that. We've heard each of these concerns from around the world.
The U.S. does not represent international public opinion.
I have to tell you, what I'm hearing is very different from what you described. I'm also hearing deep concern about some of the actions your government is taking.
A confident country is able to look hard at its own shortcomings and constantly seek to improve. And that is the secret sauce of America.
I think we thought too well of the United States. We thought you would follow the necessary diplomatic protocols. The U.S. does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength. You were not even qualified to say such things 20 or 30 years back.
So, Carl, what did you make of these statements?
Oh, I loved it. I mean, it's so great to have another country's leader to speak to U.S. so frankly in such manner. And in the beginning, when I watched the Blinken statement, it looks like, he wasn't there to dialogue. It's more like he's putting a show for the media. Okay, here we are stating our position on China. We're concerned about your human rights in Xinjiang, Taiwan, Tibet, right? We bring this list of demand. We demand you to conform to our rule-based order, right? And the Chinese side basically said, you know what, we don't buy your BS, and this is how it is. You are in no position to talk to us in that manner. Because I think it was Solomon who brought it up that we're speaking for the position of strength. So the Chinese side is addressing to that. It's like, no, you're not in no position to speak from the position of strength. And they go in a little more, and they actually said, U.S. actually U.S. need to do is to work on your own democracy. It looks like not everything is right in your house. I thought that was great.
Right. I mean, that's a true statement. When the Chinese side said the majority of Americans don't have faith in American democracy, the polls show that that's actually true. So really, these Chinese diplomats have a better understanding of American society, apparently, than pretty much any U.S. politician will admit to. I think this whole rules-based order rhetoric from Blinken, it's just a euphemism for empire, saying, China, you threaten the empire, and so you better get in line. And
the rule-based order reminds me of that graph somebody made of the so-called international community, and it's a map of just U.S., Western Europe, Japan, Australia, all the Western allies, basically. That's what they mean in English media when they talk about international community. And the Chinese side actually call U.S. out on that. It's like, no, like we don't care about the so-called a small group of countries so-called rule-based order. We uphold the UN Charter.
Right, exactly. And of course, there's a significance of these meetings taking place within a couple days of the invasions, the U.S. and the anniversaries of 3 major U.S. invasions, wars, I should say, Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, I believe. This is also the same month that the anniversary of, I think, the U.S.-backed bombing of Yemen. So, just a huge amount of regime change wars and horrors that have led to deaths of millions of people. And so, there's kind of a special significance, I think, of the Chinese side's statements really dressing down the United States in a way that's pretty unprecedented, to see, world leaders saying, no, you're not what you think you are. You don't run the world, and that, those days are in the past. And even, the way, and he said, at least, by the English translation that was provided, you didn't, even 20, 30 years ago, he said, like, you're not qualified at all to talk to China this way. And you weren't 20 or 30 years ago, but basically we're not going to take it anymore. And so, this is obviously, not typical diplomacy, but typical diplomacy is, a bit kind of not quite deceptive, but it's not direct and honest usually. So this is more, just telling the United States, it's over. We're not playing like this game anymore, right?
Yeah. So like the best moment is when the director Yang says, it's not up to the American people, but also the people of the world to evaluate how the United States has done in advancing in its own democracy. I thought that was great because China is not the interventionist power here. U.S. is the one that's getting in everybody else's business. So it's really great that from a director of Chinese foreign affairs saying, So now it's not up to American people to judge the state of American democracy. It's up to the world to judge, because essentially he's implicitly saying, because America's action, because of the interventionist policy of U.S. foreign policy, it impacts all the whole globe. So really, real democracy, the U.S. should be judged by standards of all, not just a small group of the Western allies. That was great.
Right. And I think one of the really kind of defining moments that I think to the Chinese was very obvious about what the U.S.'s intent going into this was the fact that the U.S. sanctioned a bunch of Chinese officials the day before this meeting. So, even if the U.S. was planning to sanction, at least they could have, I don't know, waited till after or something like that. But I mean, doing it the day before is such an obvious act of aggression. And that was clearly not lost on the Chinese side. They, said that straight up. So a lot of the headlines in the aftermath, after this meeting, the Washington Post had this headline, the Biden administration gets a taste of China's wolf warrior diplomacy. This whole wolf warrior thing, I mean, sounds a little yellow peril to me. What do you make of this term we're hearing, and all the the think tanks and the Western correspondents in Beijing?
So the origin of the wolf warrior comes from a Chinese movie. A series of Chinese movie, Wolf Warriors, particularly the the sequel, the Wolf Warrior 2. It's about a Chinese ex PLA guy who he's his adventure in Africa, and the bad guy was a Euro-American mercenary guy, and so basically, what the way I describe Wolf Warrior 2 to people, it's like Rambo with Chinese characteristics. Right. But people in the West are not used to that. They're not used to the Chinese diplomats talking back. They're used to people like the Secretary of State, like Pompeo, lecturing the other countries in the world about American democracy, about human rights. They're not used to the pushback, and that's why this is whole freak out in the media saying, "Oh, this is China's new wolf warrior diplomacy." It's like you brought this on yourself. This is like the Chinese is a reaction to what the U.S. has been doing for the last decade, and but all these papers, as we know, they're just rags pushing the imperialist interventionist policy anyway. So we don't expect reality.
I mean, Wolf Warrior, the second one, isn't that like the highest grossing movie in China of all time, right?
Yes.
So, clearly this whole idea of, this image of the U.S. as an aggressive character around the world, struck a chord in Chinese. I mean, I'm sure the special effects and all this stuff is awesome, but there's got to be something to that, Chinese really understood that it's actually a much more accurate portrayal, even though, it's a movie. There's a lot of truth to it.
There was a dig in the movie itself. There was because there was an American doctor who was also got caught up in kind of the civil war in the country they were in, and the Chinese guy, he picked up the American doctor, and the American doctor said she's gonna contact the U.S. government, and she's expecting the U.S. Marines to come to the rescue. And he asked the American doctor, so wait, so how did you contact them? And she's like, oh, I added them on Twitter. And in the end, of course, the Americans didn't come. And so that kind of it's kind of prescient now from the post-COVID, looking at that, the U.S. government end up doing nothing. And I think that's why it creates this panic in the Western media talking heads, right? All these pundit class, they're used to kind of the post-war Cold War, when U.S. was a sole hyperpower with no competitors after collapse of the Soviet Union. When Francis Fukuyama published the book The End of History, right? This is going to be the American hegemony from now to end of eternity. And now suddenly, you have a rising China and the Chinese diplomats speaking up frankly up to the ridiculous American demands, and also up to a point you raised earlier. The speech the director Yang gave at the Anchorage meeting was played over and over on Chinese social media. It was shared, like it has gone viral. I mean, like Chinese people loved it. They loved that their diplomat is finally standing up to United States and speaking frankly. It's like there's a narrative in the West that how the Chinese people are being brainwashed, by they're just the automatons without agency. They're being led by the nose by Chinese propaganda. In actual effect, the Chinese public are very much supportive of their diplomats speaking up against the ridiculous American foreign policy toward China.
Right. I mean, I think one of the most remarkable aspects of, not only do you have this diplomatic encounter where they're supposed to be opening 2-minute statements, but the U.S. is very aggressive. So then China goes with a 17-minute statement, basically dressing down Blinken and Sullivan. And then, this is essentially the end of it. The next day there was supposed to be, there might have been talks. There was going to be talks. And then they decided they're both just going to give statements to the media separately. And the US side, none of the US media covered the statements from the Chinese side. That was really remarkable to me because, it was only two microphones. They were both Chinese. It was Chinese journalists covering what the Chinese diplomats said. So it's like after this basically embarrassing moment for Blinken and Sullivan, the US media, which is basically a tool of the US government, is like, we don't want to give the Chinese any more airtime and embarrass Blinken any further. So and for all the talk of how propagandized Chinese are in the US, it's like we're not even allowed to hear over here what the Chinese said. They want to cover that up.
The media is totally manipulated here, and that it's not just U.S. media either, because the BBC show a clip. They just show the clip of Blinken talking. They did not even show the Chinese response. And I had to go on social media. I have to go on Facebook to see the clips of the whole dialogue, whole conversation. And what I love is that there was actually a point in time when the American diplomats asked the press to leave the room because it was so embarrassing. And that was caught on tape. And even CNN has a footage that they were actually flabbergasted that the press were asked by the American side to leave the room, whereas the Chinese side like, no, we want you to stay because we want you to hear what we have to say. I mean, that's just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's just really a kind of, I think, a watershed moment in, kind of the changing of the guard from like the American century into this, new era of, great, what the U.S. calls great power competition, but, where the U.S. isn't just able to, assert its demands to anyone and expect that, the Chinese are going to live up to, what Americans imagine them to be as, these soft and feeble people who are just gonna, make electronic parts for kids to play with over here.
There has been a lot of talk about the end of American hegemony and a transition to a multipolar world. And I think maybe like 50 years from now, historians will look back onto this week and they will see like the Putin's response to Biden and look at the Director Young's response to Blinken. And they'll probably say this week, it marks the definite start of the multilateral world, multipolar world. And also to the fact about dressing down the American diplomat is what the Chinese diplomat statement, they're based on the truth. I mean, they said, this is Young's statement. He said, he said there's the opinion polls conducted in the United States shows that the leaders of China have the support of the Chinese people. And then they also said, we do not believe in invading through use of force, to topple other regimes through various means, or to massacre the people of other countries, because all those would only cause turmoil and instability in this world. At the end of the day, all those would not serve the and also at the end of the day, all those actually would not serve the United States well either. I mean, that's just like it's so refreshing to hear that.
Right. Yeah. It's like you have one side in this Cold War rhetoric demanding, the U.S. side demanding that China basically conform to this, rules-led order. And the Chinese saying we need to move past, this Cold War mentality. So this is not, kind of two sides, two dogs barking at each other. This is like one side being an angry, frothing at the mouth dog, and the other side saying, let's move on and do what's best for everyone, and work towards making a better world for everyone, which I think is really remarkable and deserves the support of any decent person.
The thing is, a lot of the liberal media are portraying, attributing all the fault to the Trump administration, right? But what we have seen right now is Biden administration is continuing the Trump uh, foreign policy directives. Like they're following the same Cold War rhetoric and the Cold War approach of the previous Trump administration. Nothing has really fundamentally changed on the foreign policy front. We are the same, seeing the same U.S. empire interventionism everywhere across the globe, and just the whole meeting, before the meeting actually took place, there was actually a lot of hope this is a chance for a reset. With Biden coming to the administration, maybe there's a chance for both, for reset in the U.S.-Russia relationship and U.S.-China relationship. What we have seen is a exact continuation of the Trump policies. So how can you blame Trump when Biden administration is doing exactly the same thing? And that's what people don't understand. It's, as you mentioned before, this is systematic. This is how U.S. empire has always been run. And we can't, like, superficial changes, like some get another leader who, like in case of the Democrats and Republicans, they're interchangeable. They have the same U.S. foreign policy, is to uphold the U.S. hegemony.
Right. I mean, that's actually celebrated here in Washington. Throughout back in the 50s, there was a motion in Congress essentially called they call it that basically disagreements stop at the water's edge. So, you can have disagreements on domestic issues, but when it comes to foreign policy or imperialism, that there's total agreement between the Democrats and Republicans. I think the Trump era, there were certain ways that it was they'd like to say that it's an aberration. The establishment wants to say Trump was a total aberration, but at the same time, he basically, as I see it, I'm an American, we like sports analogies. So they're really simple for our brains. He ran the ball down the field, and then now Biden is in, so the team catches up and everyone is in line together. So yeah, I mean, it's total continuity between these administrations, whether it's, with China, with Russia, which we'll talk about, Venezuela, the U.S. is still supporting Guaido even after this coup has failed and tens of thousands have been killed from sanctions. The Biden administration isn't gonna conform to the JCPOA, which Trump illegally pulled out of, and they're demanding that the Iranians go back in even after the U.S. broke it. So really a lot of deceit.
Bolivia and it's amazing. Right. All the mainstream media now coming out decrying arrest of the former Bolivia. It's like now they're saying, oh, what about her human rights? It's like, hello, where were you when she was killing people, killing protesters? Right. And now you're protesting because she is actually being held accountable for her actions, which violates the constitution of Bolivia. I mean, it's just blows all these pretense talk about human rights. What Trump did, though, why a lot of the Washington elite hate him, is he revealed the emperor has no clothes. He said all the quiet parts aloud. He like during Obama era, Obama presented this very urbane image, a facade of the American imperialism. Obama is polite, he's well spoken, he know how to say the right things, right? Trump is crass. He dispenses all these niceties. So people can see what U.S. imperialism without all the bells and whistles, and that's why those liberal elite, they hate him, because oh my God, this is terrible. But it's really terrible. What's really terrible is the American empire itself. It's not just some leader who comes along and says stupid things.
Right. Yeah. Biden. You had Obama, who was very smooth and saying Al Green and was a good-looking guy. And then, as you said, Trump, just total crass, kind of pseudo-populist. And then Biden, who is you're not even sure if he's there. It's just, he's really the perfect president for the moment, I think. That it's this fading empire that's not really sure what's going on. It's trying to assert itself, but just doesn't have the like oomph. It's kind of like flaccid.
I feel sorry about that clip of him falling on the ladder to the plane. I mean, he's an old man.
Right.
I should laugh, but it's like they put him up to this. Like right. We didn't need to have. Yeah, we didn't. It's elder abuse, really. We didn't have to have him as a candidate, as the president. But no, he basically been forced upon us by the Democratic establishment because they felt he was the most safe candidate to safeguard the party interest. I mean, when they talk about, they're really talking about the interest of the big donors to the Democratic Party.
I mean, I thought maybe we'd save this before, but we mentioned Russia a little bit, and this is obviously a major aspect of this Cold War. So in the same week that basically the U.S. plotted an ambush against the Chinese, a diplomatic ambush that failed, and miserably failed and embarrassed the U.S. In the same week, you had the Office of the Director of National Intelligence release a report saying that Russia meddled, and Iran and a number of other countries, though not China, meddled in the U.S. election against Biden and also against Trump at certain moments, but mostly against Biden. Now, I examined it. There's no, there's no evidence, of course. So you have that, and then you have Biden doing this interview. Oh, and keep in mind, this is when Biden won, they said there was no meddling. It was the most safe and secure election in U.S. history.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
Then in the same week, 1 or 2 days later, Biden does an interview with George Stephanopoulos from ABC, who's a former Clinton administration White House communications director.
Director of National Intelligence came out with a report today saying that Vladimir Putin authorized operations during the election to denigrate you, support President Trump, undermine our elections, divide our society. What price must he pay?
He will pay a price. We had a long talk, he and I. I know him relatively well. And the conversation started off, I said, I know you and you know me. If I establish this occurred, then be prepared.
You said he doesn't have a soul.
I did say that to him, yes. And his response was, we understand one another. I wasn't being a wise guy. I was alone with him in his office. That's how it came about. It was when President Bush had said, I've looked in his eyes and saw a soul. I said, looked in your eyes, and I don't think you have a soul. And looked back at me and said, we understand each other. Look, most important thing dealing with foreign leaders, in my experience, and I've dealt with an awful lot of them over my career, is just know the other guy.
So you know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm. I do.
So what price must he pay?
The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see shortly. I'm not going to, by the way, we ought to be able, that trite expression, walk and chew gum at the same time. There are places where it's in our mutual interest to work together. That's why I renewed the START agreement with him. That occurred while he's doing this. But that's overwhelming in the interest of humanity that we diminish the prospect of a nuclear exchange.
Wow.
So basically, Stephanopoulos sits Biden down and corners him and tries to get him to be more aggressive. What are you going to do to punish him? What are you going to do to punish Putin? That's not journalism. That's propagandistic. That's, you're badgering the president. And I mean, it's hard to imagine for me any president who has any sort of dignity allowing a journalist to make the most, a supposed journalist to make the most provocative statements and pressure them into saying something extremely incendiary against, a foreign leader. Do you think he's a killer? And Biden, like, I do. And it's like, he obviously can't say no, because then, he'll be denounced or, in the Washington press. So you have, this moment of the ODNI report, and then, attacking China, claiming it interfered in the U.S. election. And then the Stephanopoulos interview in which, this goes viral all over the world that, Biden called Putin a killer. And then Putin says, well, he said a couple things. The U.S. Committed genocide, and I think that was one of the comments he made. Committed genocide against the indigenous and enslaved its African, American population, and also said this is like what you did on the playground when we were kids, where you said, I know you are, but what am I? And he also wished Biden good health, which when you look, okay, so he wished Biden good health, and in the moment, the next day, Biden is walking up the stairs of Air Force One and falls. He stumbles, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And so it was remarkable to see. I mean, it was almost like too perfect that Biden wishes him good health and then he falls down. And so, what was really, again, supposed to be this kind of like trap for Russia, they avoided it. Putin didn't use incendiary.
You know what's going to happen? Now they're going to say that ladder that they use is made in Russia.
right, exactly.
Sabotage Biden to make him fall. But there's actually, I saw a meme video where Putin is shooting a gun and then Biden falls. But the thing is, Biden is the perfect president for the U.S. press, for the Stephanopoulos to do that kind of thing. Because when I was watching the clip of Biden responding to the media questions, it just seems like he's not all there. It's like I'm not sure he understood the question and the impact and where how his answer will be perceived. Which he's perfect for that role. It's like the U.S. media has a narrative to push against Russia, and they bounce it, like you said, they set Biden up, and then they got what they wanted. They got the soundbite. That's all they care about.
Right. And even Biden, tried to kind of walk it back a little. The first thing he said is, oh, yeah, years ago, I told Putin that he doesn't have a soul. So he was trying to go to like the old hits to be like, yeah, I said that a long time ago. And then but he's a killer, right? And oh, yeah, he's a killer. So what are you going to do to punish him? And then Biden even says like, well, yeah, like he's a bad guy, but we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time so we don't get into a nuclear war. He's at least with it enough to say, to kind of try to make the point that this is really dangerous. We're in a dangerous moment. You're trying to push confrontation between nuclear powers. And so, with these two moments of trying to do this diplomatic ambush against China and against Russia, and both of them just basically falling flat on their face and embarrassing the U.S. So the Russians put out a statement basically supporting the Chinese after this, diplomatic kind of blow up. And so, I think it's really significant to see that there is cooperation and between the Chinese and the Russians, unlike in the previous Cold War when you had, the Sino-Soviet split, which was a major benefit to the U.S. In winning the Cold War. So, what do you make of that, Carl, of the, Chinese-Russian relations, especially in context of the prior Cold War?
I actually saw a tweet by a Russian professor. He was amazed that U.S. would choose to antagonize Russia and China at the same time, right? And I responded to I quip. I say, as any Americans will tell you, our leaders are not the smartest bunch, right? But then I take it back. Actually, we do have all these political elite in Washington. They're very smart about one thing. They're very smart about making grift out of the military-industrial complex, right? They're very smart about giving their donors money. They just don't care if U.S. have a bad relationship with Russia or China. What does that impact them personally? Nothing. What they do benefit from with increasing tension between China and Russia is they keep on getting the funds coming in from all the weapons manufacturers like Raytheon, like Lockheed Martin, right? And that's all they care about. They care about their own short-term personal profit. They like to use the phrase American interest, but what it really meant is their own personal interest to profit from the system. And about the China-Russia relationship, as you mentioned, the Sino-Soviet split was a serious issue. But actually at the end of the Cold War, when the Gorbachev visited China in 1989, the two sides have settled down into a more friendly neighboring relations. But after the Cold War, what U.S. has done, but through its sheer stupid foreign policy, is to push Russia and China closer and closer together by expanding the NATO eastward, which U.S. had promised Russia they would not do. Bill Clinton had promised Yeltsin he would not expand NATO to Russia's border. What they did? Now they're pushing war up to against Ukraine-Russian border. I mean, I would never imagine like back in 80s or 90s, like Russians and Ukrainians will be fighting a war. I mean, but this is all happened thanks to NATO, thanks to United mechanisms of United States. And why wouldn't Russia and China cooperate when U.S. is pushing hard against both countries? And to answer to seriously answer the good Russian professor's question, why would U.S. choose to do that? Because their institutional interest. There's NATO. The sole reason for NATO is to counter and contain Russia. After Cold War, NATO had to find a purpose to continue its existence. All these bureaucracy that was built up during the Cold War. They wanted to continue. The threat, the grift is too good. People don't want to give it up, and so we have all these NATO aligned interests, all these people within the NATO bureaucracy want to continue the Cold War against Russia. And on the side of China, since the end of the Soviet Union, U.S. have been trying to find another near-peer competitor to serve as a boogeyman, right? To continue to justify the military industrial complex spending. And now with China's rising, they found the perfect replacement for the former Soviet Union. So now we get all this China bashing, but at the same time they cannot give up on the Russia bashing because they still have this whole institution of NATO, right? They want to preserve. So you have that interest, and then you have this additional interest from the other part of the U.S. military industrial complex that want to increasing tension with China so they can sell more weapons. You can justify the $1 trillion Pentagon budget, right? Like, forget about healthcare. We need 355 warships in the U.S. Navy.
Right. I mean, one of the things I saw towards the end of the Trump administration was a few Republican officials proposing this idea of trying to warm up relations with Russia in order to counter China, as of course, China becomes, in the Washington consensus, the main threat. And this is, of course, after 4 or 5 years of Russiagate. And, so there was like some understanding that it's pretty impossible to have, 2 Cold Wars going on at the same time against, 2 very formidable countries. And, so of course, Biden won. And so even that idea is totally gone. And so the U.S. is in overdrive against China and Russia, of course, with NATO, as you said, coming closer and closer to Russian borders. And then at the same time, we have Blinken and Sullivan. The main part of their diplomatic trip was to ensure what's what is called the Quad, this U.S.-led alliance, kind of similar to NATO in the Pacific, with Australia, India, South Korea, and Japan. The U.S. calls democracies. India is led by Modi, who's basically, is widely decried as a fascist.
Yeah, actually, right now, South Korea is not even sure about joining the Quad, right. And we get a lot of kind of snide comments about the South Korean president Moon Jae-in because he's not fully on board with this contain China bandwagon. Now, sometimes, now you can notice when U.S. Media corps start talking shit about foreign leaders, that's when because the U.S. State Department is not happy. They're not following into line of the U.S. policies. And again, like you mentioned, there's also the domestic U.S. politics, right? Because the 2016 election, the Democrats, they can't just admit to the fact that they chose the worst candidate to field the election. They can't admit to that. Instead, they try to bring Russia in as a scapegoat. And as you mentioned, Trump administration did try to switch the focus on China instead of Russia because even back during the Cold War era, Kissinger and Nixon basically they play the China cards against Soviet Union, and they're trying to do a reverse, right? Now they're trying to loop in Russia against China, but then they sabotage themselves because even when Trump is trying to get closer to Russia, he got a huge pushback from within the administration, within the institutions of U.S. military, of NATO, of all these people who want to, as I mentioned, who want to continue the too good to be true grift of the NATO's containment of Russia. So right now we are kind of like an empire on steroids. And there's no check and balances. like even when Trump trying to reset the course, that's not possible. The whole ship of the empire is set on its course. Now we are set on full confrontation with both Russia and China, which is, to any other reasonable people, sounds really stupid. But yeah.
Right. I mean, this whole Quad concept, started actually back under the Bush administration. In 2007, is become much more of kind of a foreign policy, top issue just lately. But they put out a statement, which is essentially declaration of new Cold War, and kind of is very much tracks with the language that we hear from U.S. diplomatic military circles, talking about it's the same language that Blinken used with, rules-based order in the East and South China Seas. And in the Quad, but also here in Washington, there's this increasing focus in, what they call the Indo-Pacific region, which has only really come into mainstream political jargon in the last few years here in Washington. Yeah. And they kind of see it as a key area of containing China. So, what do you make of this shift towards the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I have to remind people, before 9/11, 2001, early part of 2001, there was a spy plane incident over Highland Islands of China. That's when Rumsfeld decided to increase the frequency of flying spy planes right up against Chinese coast. And then they ended up with a collision, and then it was a major diplomatic incident when the U.S. spy plane crews were forced landed on Highland Island after the collision with the Chinese fighter. There was a very high tension at that moment. It was only the confrontation between China and U.S. was only diverted by 9/11. After that, they found another enemy, right? Then we got sidetracked by the war on terror, and the U.S. got involved in the war in the Middle East for the next 10 years. But now what happened is now that the war in the Middle East is wrapping up to a close, now for all the U.S. Army that wants to stay in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, the U.S. Navy wants to, be part of the grip. They want more spending on warships, right? That's why they have that proposal to have they believe they need to have 355 warships in the U.S. Navy. And one of the U.S. Navy commander was on record of saying, if I could have warships filling up the Pacific so we can walk from U.S. to Asia, I would do that. I mean, he literally said that. It's like, so this is really not really about, it's not really about protecting the U.S. homeland, right? I mean, it's all about increasing the grift, increasing the budget spending to their part of the military industrial complex. And so after I get on these blogs of all these armchair generals, these chicken hawks, right? They talk about strategy, and what I noticed is that they after 2008 Beijing Olympics, Americans suddenly realized, wow, China is not the poor country they imagine it to be back in like 1980s, 1990s. Like China is now rising to be a modern country. At the same time, United States itself finds itself in the Great Recession as a result of the financial crisis. Now they feel threatened, especially the role of U.S. hegemony. U.S. is a number one superpower in the world. Looks like China has a realistic chance to pass the United States in terms of the size of the economy. That freaked people out because the policy elite, their whole life have been rested on the premise the U.S. hegemony is going to continue forever to eternity, and now their whole world is threatened by rising China. That's why we're now having a increasing focus of the U.S. All the U.S. foreign policy powers is aligned to contain China. I mean, like they don't even make before they make a whole great show about supposedly concern about human rights in China, and now they realize actually a majority of the Chinese population are fully supportive of the Chinese government. There's more support for Chinese government within China than there's support for American government within the United States. So now they are now they're saying, okay, the whole of China is a bad entity that must be walled off and contained, and that's why they have this idea of so-called the Quad, the democracy, Japan, Australia, India. But we're talking about India with the Modi's government that's locking down Kashmir, that's been cracking down on its own Muslim minorities, and it's enforcing the very dangerous, Hindu nationalism in its own country. But no, it's a democracy, right? We are really trying to. I don't know what kind of values I hope to impose China, but it's increasingly hard to disguise and to hide the real intention is to break up China so China does not present a threat to U.S. hegemony. This all has been what's it about?
Right. I mean, it's pretty remarkable to see the fixation, in the West of this supposed genocide of Uyghur Muslims while allying with India's Modi, who is, as you said, this Hindu nationalist he's presided over massacres of Muslims. And I mean, I haven't heard anyone mention Modi since they were, using him to attack Tulsi Gabbard for the crime of trying to de-escalate tensions, to de-escalate the dirty war on Syria. So, I mean, it's pretty rich to talk about these democracies. I mean, there's also, I got to wonder how much. I think South Korea and Japan are two of the top trading partners of China. So, Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, I mean, he really made serious attempts to make peace, to bring the war with North Korea to an end. And those were basically stymied by the Trump administration, and not even by Trump so much himself, by Bolton and figures around him. And then, so as you said, he's not really like so much on board with this whole Quad containment strategy. So obviously, escalating against China doesn't really serve the interests of South Korea. And what is, I don't know how much you follow Japanese politics, but I mean, how do you see it? I mean, it's hard to see Japan, really benefiting from some major escalation with China, considering they're, huge trade partners.
Yeah, you would think, right? I mean, let me speak about Australia, because Australia would also fall into the category of, Australia's largest trading partner is China. They literally had a show on Australian television on ABC few years ago. They have a comedy show called Utopia, making fun of Australian foreign policy. It's a skit where they're calling the high-level meetings, trying to justify the defense the 400 million increase in their defense budget, and they're asking, "Oh, what's it for?" Okay, we're protecting our trade route. Okay, we're protecting our trade route with who? With China, because China is our largest trading partner. So you're saying we're spending 400 million, we need 400 million additional spending on defense so we can protect our trade route with China from China, right? I mean, that's the kind of the predicament of Australia. But the problem with Australia is its political elite has been so dominated by the United States. And right now, Australia, their government is dominated by a conservative party led by Scott Morrison, who decided to go full in with the Trump policy of containing China to kind of show loyalty to the United States as a client state of U.S. And totally going against Australian own economic interests. But Australia is doing that for other reasons too, because Australia, being very close to the United States, another white settler colony on the edge of Asia, they have this psychological anxiety about being taken over by this yellow horde that's coming down from the north, and they felt they need to grab on to their big brother, the United States, to protect them from their fate. So they would, because of this kind of psychosis, they would go so far against their own economic interests to go on this, hop on this anti-China bandwagon. Now, there's Japan. Japan has its own issue with the history, because the Japanese Empire is not that long ago. Its memory is still fresh in much of Asia, and Japan is like so Japan in a way also felt threatened by rising China, because I think it's a guilty conscience speaking. They always fear there's going to be revenge. It's like analogy will be like United States. When United States were sending Marines to Beijing during Boxer Rebellion, that's when the Yellow Peril narrative started to proliferate in the United States. It's like, in actuality, U.S. is sending the Marines to Beijing, but somehow we're talking about, we are afraid of a Chinese invasion of California. It's kind of the guilty conscience talking, right? It's a lot of
projection.
Yeah, so Japan has this kind of the same relationship with China, because the Japanese recent history, which it never come fully to term with. Because the aid and abet with aid and help with United States, because when United States took over Japan, instead of doing a full denazification a la Germany, they felt they needed to keep all that Japanese superstructure in place to turn Japan into a bastion of anti-communism against Soviet Union and China. And so Japan has all that historical baggage, right? They never dealt with their World War II legacy. So they are afraid of rising China. They're afraid. So they climb, make them like Australia. They climb together to the U.S.-Japan alliance even more, even though Japan has China is Japan's largest trading partner, and so we have that but Japan, Australia are really the outliers in East Asia. Like now I'm in Southeast Asia. Most of the Asian countries, they rather just do business. They don't want to get involved in a new Cold War between U.S. and China. And not necessarily because they're pro-China. It's because they're benefiting from peace and stability and a profitable trading relationship with China. They don't want a Cold War to screw that up, or like a Cold War that could flare up in a hot war, right? But it's the United States that's forcing them to take a side, like whether you're with me or against me. And the U.S. have done that since, like you mentioned, since a late Bush's term, and Hillary Clinton formalized that into pivot to Asia when her term as the Secretary of State. And the pivot to Asia was not economic, was not cultural, it was all military. And that's what that's what's driving U.S. foreign policy most of the time now. It's just that it feels like the Pentagon is setting our foreign policy.
We've covered a lot. Anything else you feel is important to add? I mean, we talked about the kind of U.S. orientation with China, Russia, these kind of political ambushes, diplomatic ambushes that the U.S. tried to do, and how the U.S. kind of ended up embarrassing itself, embarrassing Biden, embarrassing Blinken. And so, I think anything else you want to add, but I think we can leave it there.
Yeah, I think we covered most of it. I just wanted to add to that U.S. to China meeting in Alaska, because prior to the meeting, there was a lot of hope for a reset. Finally, the two sides are sitting down talking to each other. But when watching the video, what strikes me was that they're not really talking to each other. It's like Blinken is making a statement for the media for the purpose of like a media clip that can be played on BBC and CNN, right? That's why he started hammering on China to appear like we are tough on China. We're speaking. The U.S. is back, right? The U.S. is speaking from a position of strength, and that's why he got the pushback from the Chinese side. And so it looks like at this point, the U.S. political leader is doing what they have always been doing. They're more interested in making grandstanding than actual to carry out policies that solve problems. I mean, that applies to the foreign policy. I mean, maybe they don't see a problem with the U.S.-China tension. I think it's probably by design. It's not an accident. We are in kind of the situation where right now is rising tension between U.S., Russia, and China, and Iran, and much of the global South. It's by design, because that's how the empire in its last days are. It's on autopilot.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think we're going to see kind of, any sobriety here in Washington, at least for a while. And it seems like this, I don't know, on one hand, it seems like it's accelerating, and but on the other hand, it just could go on for a long time. And there's so much decay in the U.S. So it's hard to see how things are going to get better.
Which is really sad, because the United States is still the richest country in the world. Like if we really put our mind to it, we could do so much more, just in terms of improving conditions of the U.S. citizens, people within our borders. But now it's going to be, instead of healthcare, we're just going to spend another $1 trillion on the defense budget.
Right. One of the actually more remarkable tidbits that I saw in the Chinese side's speech is that they said China has 1/5 of the GDP per capita, 1/6,
yeah,
per capita of the U.S. Yet has eliminated extreme poverty. So that kind of shows not only the priorities of the Chinese and the U.S., but also how insanely wealthy the U.S. is as a whole, and how concentrated that wealth is in the hands of a tiny few that just have no interest and are totally opposed to eliminating poverty. In fact, want to create more poverty because they get wealthier. So you just have diametrically opposed systems. And that was a really incisive comment that I don't think I didn't see anyone really pick up on. But
yeah, I think what people don't realize, a lot of the commentary don't realize, because we have a system it's run for the benefit of the oligarchs. We have people like Jeff Bezos buying up Washington Post and pumping us full of corporate propaganda, so we can be distracted with our fights with China, with Russia, and not to think about why Jeff Bezos is getting wealthier and wealthier while most of the common Americans are having a hard time. I mean, this is and this is a world. U.S. is where if you have money, you can set the agenda, and that's not the case in China. And I think that's the fundamental difference, because China can actually tell Jack Ma, like, no, they just pulled the IPO of Jack Ma's new company out because they felt like it was there are many financial loopholes that could potentially trap young people and financially unsophisticated people into debt, right? So that's the reason they stopped an IPO. Like in U.S., that would not even be an issue.
That was the whole basis of the financial crash. In a lot of ways, was getting people into these horrible mortgages they can't afford, and like speculating on them in order to get them into debt and screw them, and it destroyed the economy. And then the banks got bailed out. I mean, that should be illegal. But here,
when Jack Ma got stopped, we have all these sympathetic pieces in Washington Post and New York Times, like, oh my God, China just silenced Jack Ma. It's like, I see where your priority is.
Right. The poor billionaires.
Yeah.
All right. Well, then we'll leave it there. Carl Zha, thanks a lot for joining me, host of the Silk and Steel podcast. Checking in from what looks to be a horrible, awful beach island in the Southeast Asia. I'm very sorry for you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Dan. Always a pleasure to talk.